energy. So we'll get into that. But as you know, the start of the program, we always start with the why, right?
Yes.
It's like, why does singularity exist? Now, you are one of the founding partners. You were around for the very beginning. Sure, SU has changed a lot over the years, but the founding sort of like principle remains, which is this notion of we understand that all of these technologies are developing in this way. They're giving us much more options, many more things to do with them, and we are inviting all of everyone to play a significant role with those technologies. Now, one of the things that we know some people come in with is this idea of like, well, not me. Like, there's other people doing the innovating, and there's other people doing the. So I'd love to,
Sure.
by way of introduction, if you could just level set us in the room, is like that call to action is really to have everyone feel like there's a role for them to play, which I know is something you feel very passionate about as well.
Very good. So first of all, many of us really feel afraid of doing things because we think we just don't know much about it. And if we don't know much about it, then how can we possibly add much value to it? And I'm here to tell you that if once you become an expert in something, you become useless. Because the best you can be is to be 10% better than someone else. You will never be 10 times better than someone else, because to be 10 times better, you have to be able to challenge the foundation of everything that experts have taken it for granted. What makes someone an expert is because they have a foundational knowledge. And they hold on to it because that's what makes them an expert. Until someone comes along and says, but why? And suddenly the whole foundation falls apart and you have a completely new way of thinking. And to me, a non-expert, if you go back and look at every single paradigm shift, it is never the incumbent that actually moved to the next generation. It is always someone who came from outside the industry and challenged everything that they have done. Look at aerospace. It wasn't the Lockheed Martin and all these guys who were building the rockets for the longest time ever thought about building a reusable rocket. It's the guy who says from the internet, he said, why not? Right? And that's really what it takes to rethink everything. And I'm going to give you a framework of how you go about doing that. Because it's not something you say, well, I'm not Elon, I'm not that smart. But the point is, you don't have to be smart. You just have to have the right framework of how you think about solving a problem. And I'm going to start giving you the framework. So by the time this session is done, you're going to have a framework of exactly how to think about solving these audacious challenges.
Yes. Well, about that framework,
Yeah.
it's a why framework, right? And it's one you've applied. Is that, where do you want to start?
Well,
Would you want to start with how you've applied that in the past? Because I know we've talked a bit about your
Yeah.
moonshot thinking. You're quite an example of that, we would say. Can we dive into your current moonshot yet? Because sometimes when I ask you this question, you push back. No, okay, that's what I
Not yet.
figured.
No,
Not
no.
yet.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
great. Well, fine enough. How then, generally speaking, would you say someone goes about finding what their moonshot is and what they can contribute
great. So let's just start with a
Better.
framework. And
Yes.
because I think then I can say this is the framework, and I'll give you an example of how I apply to it, and maybe that will make much more sense to it. And I'll give you, different industries, not just 1, 2, or 3 industries. I want you to start thinking about how you can apply this framework to everything that you do. And if I miss something, I'm going to be outside after this talk, and find me at the fire pit, and we can spend as much time as you want going through your problems, okay? All right. So the framework starts with asking yourself 3 questions. Why this? Why now? Why me? So why this is a very simple thing that says, go backward. God forbid I am actually successful in solving the problem that I set out to solve. Whatever it is that you want to do, assume it is successful. Would it help 1 billion people live a better life? And the reason I say that is not because I'm a philanthropist, I'm a capitalist. But as a capitalist, you should always know, if you can find any problem, any product, any service that can help 1 billion people live a better life, you can create a $100 billion company. But you never wake up in the morning and saying, what should I do to create a $100 billion company? Making money is simply a byproduct of doing things that improve people's lives. That's it. Find something that will improve people's lives, you have a company to build. And if you can help 1 billion people, you can create a $100 billion company. Right? Then you say, okay, now that I have a problem that is, it can help 1 billion people, now what? The next question you have to ask yourself, is the time now? That why now has two pieces to it. Number one is, what changed in the last 2 to 3 years, but more importantly, what do you expect to change in the next 3 to 5 years that will allow you to solve this problem at scale in 3 to 5 years? And this problem could not have been solved 5 years ago, right? So think about how you're going to intercept many of the technologies that you're hearing about here. How are you going to intercept generative AI? If the cost of sensors are coming down, cost of processing is coming down, cost of AI is coming down, what can you do in next 3 to 5 years that couldn't have been done 5 years ago? What problems would you solve? The second part of this puzzle really is, you never focus on how, you focus on what is it that need to be solved for your big problem to be solved. So for example, if you say, I want to live on Saturn, why not? Right? You never say, oh, that is not going to happen and I don't know how to do that. You simply say, what are the problems that need to be solved for me to live on Saturn? Right? So you start breaking it down. Number one, I have to be able to leave the Earth gravity. So you go from Earth's surface all the way to the Earth orbit. So I'm out of the gravity well. Number one. Number two, I have to be able to travel from all the way from Earth orbit, all the way to Saturn orbit. Number three, I have to be able to land on Saturn. And number four, find a way to create a habitat and live there, right? There are only 4 problems. And then you start to say, okay, leaving the Earth gravity, we know how to do that. We call them rockets. We have done many, many times. I don't have to invent anything. This is a problem that's already solved. You say, how do I go from Earth orbit to Saturn? You say, well, we have been to Mars multiple times, and we have taken 2 horizon things that have gone way beyond our solar system. We do know how to go long distance, and maybe if there are people in there, and maybe it has to be modified a bit, but that's incremental stuff that we can do. In terms of landing on Saturn, you do the same thing. You say, look, we landed on Mars 3 different ways. The first time was a bouncing ball, second time was a parachute, and the third time was using a crane. We say, great. So maybe the Saturn has less atmosphere than Mars, and maybe we have to modify one of these things, but it is fundamentally, incrementally, slightly, maybe a better solution. But it's not something that we don't know how to do. And the 4th problem comes down to is, how are you going to live there, right? And this is where my last question comes in, which is, why me? Why me is the most important part of this whole framework. And this is about what questions are you asking that are different from what everyone else in the industry is asking. The questions you ask is the problems we solve. So what questions are you asking? So when you say, I want to live on Saturn, if you're asking the questions, how am I going to grow the food on Saturn, then there is a set of problems you're going to solve. But what if you were going to ask a completely different question that says, why do we eat food? When you ask a question, why do we eat food, you suddenly realize the only reason to eat food is we need energy and we need nutrition. How many different ways can we get energy? And you realize there are plants who get energy from photosynthesis. They take the sunlight, they take carbon dioxide, turn that into the energy. There are bacteria that are living in radioactive nuclear waste. Not only they have figured out how to protect their DNA from the radiation, they have also figured out how to use radiation as a source of energy. What if you could take a genetic material from these bacteria, use CRISPR to modify our own DNA, and suddenly not only we are radiation resistant, we are able to use radiation as a source of energy. Honey, do you want to go out and get some radiation? Not, honey, do you want to go out and get some pizza? Right? Suddenly the whole problem changes from growing the food to different solutions that you never thought would ever apply to the things you were trying to do. So that's really understanding this. By asking a different question, it fundamentally changes what problems you're going to be solving. The second part is always understanding, are you solving the symptom of the problem, or are you actually solving the root cause of the problem? Right? Many of us are so good at finding the problem and say, oh, I got the problem, and you solve it without realizing it is simply a symptom, not actually the root cause. So for example, we all know that in many of the developing countries, one of the biggest problems is fresh water, clean fresh water. And we say, you know what? I can build some type of nano straw, I can build some kind of a nano device that can actually create clean fresh water. Until you ask yourself, why do we have this shortage? It turns out majority of all the fresh water is used for agriculture. And you say, oh, that is really the problem. Maybe I should build aeroponic agriculture, maybe I should put aquaponic or different ways of growing the food so I don't use the fresh water so it can go to the people. And you feel really good until you ask yourself, really, all this agriculture, where does it really go? Well, it turns out majority of all the things that we grow is actually used to feed the cattle. So majority of the agriculture is used to feed the cattle. And you suddenly realize, what if you don't need the cattle? What if you can just simply, you're going to eat muscle tissues, you're not going to eat the eyes, you're not going to eat the ears, why not just grow the muscle tissues? And if you can do that, suddenly a fresh water problem that you thought was really turning out to be a synthetic biology problem, and that's a root cause. And this time you got into simply 2 whys. Generally, it takes you 3 whys. Think like a 2-year-old. But why? Do you have any of the young kids? But Dad, why? But why? And that's what you get to the root cause. And I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about, now that we talk about children, how do you raise children and about parenting, because that's really the key to asking the right questions.
I know we're going to touch on that, and I love the gleam in your eye you get when it just is about kids. I know you're very proud of your kids as well, so I do want to touch on that, certainly. I also just want to, just for a moment, enjoy your faces when Naveen suggests we should photosynthesize, and that you will have to think about things like a 2-year-old, because we see this, right? We see people come back from singularity programs and they sound like aliens, and we have a group of people who are here we have a couple of people sent by their CEO, and I think one of them had a CEO that came back and sounded just like an alien, right? Because you may sound a bit like a crazy person. So do you want to do kids? We're going to do kids. We're going to do...
Let's talk about the aliens. So
let's talk about aliens first. Okay, good. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually, I really mean it. I mean, I don't mean aliens in a sense. This is one of the biggest problems we see, the people who come to the Singularity executive programs. You actually find yourself thinking differently. And it rarely happens on day 1. Somewhere between 2nd day and the 3rd day, the light bulb goes on. And suddenly you start to think differently. And everyone around you, you start to ask questions, and you all starting to make sense. Until, unfortunately, the thing ends and you go home. Your kids think you have completely turned aliens. So wherever you went to NASA, they have turned them into aliens. You make no sense anymore. When you go to work, they think you drank some type of a Kool-Aid, maybe probably some drugs, because you make no sense whatsoever, and they know eventually you're going to get sober and going to get back to work and never talk about this again. Right? And that's really what ends up happening. And this is really a problem, because how do we get everyone else to think just like you do? And that's one of the biggest problems you're going to face when you go back. Right? So there are a couple of things you do. You start to create the curiosity in them, which is going to be a big challenge. So the only way would be for a couple of people from each organization to come here, so when you go back, you have someone to talk to. You're not alone. And if you can create a tipping point where you have just enough of the people from the organization who thinks the same way, the whole organization changes. Same thing at home. When we did this thing, we had every one of our child, all three of our kids, they all came to Singularity University. Because I wanted them to have a discussion that made sense. Because suddenly it wasn't just me. They were asking me questions to say, but Dad, why would you not do it this way? Right? And that's when you start to find some amazing stuff that happens.
Yeah, I know about 75% of the people here know someone who also went here before, so now you know why they really wanted you to go, so that you can have a conversation about these things. Let's touch on that, though, from the perspective of your kids, because I think you and the way that I know you enjoy talking about your kids, and they do great stuff, but it's also a way in which to cultivate that curiosity, right? So
Sure.
let's touch on that for a bit.
Good. So obviously, as you can imagine, I'm an old man. I turned 65, actually just about a month ago. So September 6th, I turned 65. Well, good thing is my biological age actually is 33. Right? So that's really a good thing. And my oldest is 34, just in case you're wondering. Right? So biologically, I am really good. Right? And I'm going to come back and talk to you about how you can also be biologically young. So we'll get there in a second here. So I have three children. Our oldest, 34, went to Wharton. And he is today in the news. Every day you go, his name is Naveen Jain. He started a company called Built. And that's unicorn. So that is actually in last 2 years since he started. The company just raised $350 million at $3.5 billion valuation. He's on the Forbes list, in case you're wondering. What is it about him that he did? And I'm going to come back and show you about how exactly we talked about how to change their thinking. Our daughter is 30. She went to Stanford. She is Stanford Mayfield Fellow. First company she did was to use AI to remove gender bias, and now she started a company called Evvy, EVVY, which is a women's health company, and it's another unicorn. Completely changing the way women's health is done. Did you know that until a couple of decades ago, women weren't even allowed to be in a clinical trial? That means every drug that women take are never tested on women. They don't work on women. Every time they go for diagnosis, most of the women are diagnosed 7 years later than men, because no diagnostic tools were developed for women. And she set out to solve that problem. Our youngest also went to Stanford, and he's a Schwarzman scholar. He's at a fintech company that's also a unicorn. Now, what happened here? Now, as you can imagine, I came from India. We were very, very poor. We had no food to eat. We had no place to stay. I came to the United States 42 years ago with $5 in my pocket. God has been just so kind to us that I look back and think there is nothing that we could possibly have asked for that we don't have. And our children, when they grew up in an extremely affluent family, knowing that they don't have to work for a living for a day. In fact, so much so, me and my wife talked and said maybe we could move into a small house, and we can tell our children we don't really have much money. And I said, sweetie, someday, unfortunately, they're going to learn to read, and they're going to realize that daddy's not poor. Right? Why not? Tell them that they don't have to do it, but why not give them the set of values that they would actually want to do it? So I'm going to now tell you a couple of interesting things, and you guys are going to start going home and implementing it. Number one, children don't do what you tell them to do. They do what they see you do. Now, this is really interesting. Many of you work in a corporate environment. You go home, you bitch about your boss, you hate your boss, and next day morning you go back to work. And you want your kids to become an entrepreneur. What are they seeing? My dad doesn't take any risk. He hates his job, and he still goes back to job. That is what life is all about. Interestingly, my first company that I started became so successful, it went on to become in dot-com days over $40 billion. Our kids were all under 10 years old. I was just 40 years old at that time. we could have easily said, hey, I'm going to spend time with my young children. And everybody said, what a great dad. He quit his thing and he's now spending time with kids. Now imagine that would have been the most selfish thing to do at the cost of our children. What do children see? Dad, when they go to school, dad is sitting on the sofa watching CNBC. When they come back from school, dad says, work hard. Hard work is what it takes. Go back to your room and work hard. Dad is sitting on the sofa watching CNBC. What do they want to do? When they grow up, they want to be just like dad, sit on the sofa and watch CNBC. Instead, this dad was crazy. He starts a second company. He starts a third company. He starts a fourth company and says, we're going to go to the moon. We're going to mine the moon. Dad, that can't be done. Nobody has ever done that. We became the first company to get permission to leave Earth orbit. We got the law changed by President Obama that anything we bring back, we get to own it. We became one of the 6 companies that got $2.6 billion NASA contract to mine the moon. Dad turned 60. Dad says, we're going to solve the healthcare problem. They're thinking, they literally had a family meeting. Dad, it's time to retire. Healthcare? Are you kidding me? You know nothing about healthcare. You're not going to ever succeed. You're going to get bloodied. You're going to go out in shame. Why not retire and go ride the sunset? Well, looks like the dad hasn't taught you much yet. So let me show you how healthcare problems can be solved. And by this time, kids are thinking, my dad is a complete moron. And if he can do these things, let me show him how to do these right. And we're going to go out and do something even more amazing than he has ever done. Right? We changed the whole perspective about success is never going to be measured by how much money they have. Success is going to be measured by how many lives they improved. We redefined success for them to say your self-esteem never comes from what you own. Your self-esteem comes from what you create. And if you haven't created anything, you're still a parasite on society. So don't be a parasite. Now, this is the big part I want you to take home about creating intellectual curiosity. So, our job as a parent, our job as a leader when we are in corporate environment is not to take our people to the water and make them drink. Our job is to make them thirsty. Once you make someone thirsty, they will find their own water and they will drink. So how do you make someone thirsty? Is give them intellectual curiosity. Ask them to rethink about what they're seeing can be actually be wrong. So imagine your child comes to you and says, Dad, what a beautiful blue sky. And you could easily say, you're right, that's a beautiful blue sky. Or you could say, well, son, you know the sky doesn't really exist, right? Sky is nothing but a figment of our imagination. It is simply the blue light that's scattered, and we see that as a boundary called sky. It doesn't really exist. And think about the blue color. There is no such thing as blue color. It's simply the electromagnetic waves that are hitting our retina, and our mind actually makes up this color. The pigs don't see the same color. The rats don't see the same color. The bats don't see the same color. It is simply something we make up in our own mind. And it's not about teaching them science. It is about showing them something they see with their own eyes they're absolutely certain about. That what if that was actually wrong? What if that was not true? This is how you create the intellectual curiosity of what if? What if that was not true? What if this could be something totally different? And once you do that, they start to challenge everything. Everything they see, say, what if that was wrong? What if this could be done differently? And that what if is really the way once you start. So everything I do, every company I start, my first question always ask is, what if? What if we could do this? What if this was possible? Right? And that's really how you solve the most audacious ideas, most audacious challenges. Does it make sense to you guys? I can go on and on about parenting. So when they were young, most parents, you read stories to your children, right? Interestingly, this parent did not do that. we actually would sit down with them and say, hey, tell me a story about an ocean, a tree, and a monkey. I want them to start connecting the dots of the things that were never connected before. And they will turn around and say, Dad, your turn now. Tell me a story about this, this, and this. They want to see the things that were never could be connected. How can you find an abstract way to connect these things and create a story out of it? It allows their brain neurons to connect in a way that was never connected before. It allows them to start thinking differently. It allows them to see there are no separate dots. Every dot can be actually be connected to something else. And you start to put these things together, and they suddenly realize the problems that looked unsolvable can be solved when you put these three dots together. Right? And that's the kind of thinking once you bring that into a child, once you bring into yourself, everything changes. Every problem that you thought is unsolvable, it starts to become solvable problem.
Can I ask about your current moonshot yet?
Sure.
Because you've brought this notion of what if, and I know the latest one has been spurred by a what if question.
Yes.
Let's dive into that one.
Sure. So about 7 years ago, I found myself in this unpredicament. My dad was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And he was given 3 months to live. And unfortunately, that's all he got. And it really got me thinking that there was nothing I could have done. There was no symptoms. That we live in this 21st century, and we had no idea that he had a cancer. Why couldn't we have diagnosed his cancer early? And then I started to think about it, that he is in early 80s. I had just taken it for granted that as he's getting older, of course he's going to have diabetes. Of course he's going to have heart disease. Of course he's going to have high blood pressure. Of course he's going to have all these diseases. It is just what happens when you get old. Until I started to think and saying, wait a sec. We as human species haven't really changed in the last 100 years. Then why is it younger and younger people are getting sicker and sicker? Younger and younger people are getting cancer. Younger and younger people getting these diseases. What had changed? We are still the same human species. And this is where I said, what if? What if we can actually understand what changes in the human body at the onset of these chronic diseases, whether we call them diabetes or heart disease or depression or Parkinson's or Alzheimer or cancer or even aging? What is it that changes in the human body? Now, first thing was, we ask ourselves, what if we can actually understand this is possible? We'll be able to prevent these diseases from happening. We'll be able to diagnose them early and, God forbid, outright reverse them. And my first question was, so what? If you could do that, would it help 1 billion people? The answer was 8 billion people. Every one of us is going to suffer through that. So if we can solve that, why this 8 billion people check mark? Why now? I said, well, to solve this problem, there have to be 3 things that we have to solve. We have to be able to digitize the human body. We have to be able to process this massive amount of data. And number 3, use AI to be able to make some sense of this data. So we say, okay, what's happening with the digitization? 7 years ago when we did that, the cost of a single sequence or single sample was about $1,200. And we took a deep breath and saying that you can't help 1 billion people. But we know it has come down significantly in the next 3 to 5 years. It should be coming down to $100. And despite what Tiffany told you, we actually are able to use the Illumina X Plus, and our cost is $4.73. Complete unbiased sequencing. I'll tell you how we do that. In terms of processing, we knew we will never have access to supercomputer. We knew we could use the cloud computing. The first time we fired up, it cost us $47 for a single sample. We said, wow, that's too high. But we knew it has come down. In the next 3 to 5 years, it should come down to $10. Today we sit here and the cost is about $1.25. And we all were convinced that AI was going to be there for us, so we realized the time to start was now. And that's the reason we started the company 7 years ago. Now, the last question was, as I said, was the most important part. Why me? As you can possibly imagine, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an MD. And that was my biggest asset. So while everyone in the industry, you heard from Tiffany, was focused on what? Understanding your DNA. Well, we said, does your DNA change when you become diabetic? The answer is no. So if you were to do my DNA test today, and I gain 200 pounds, and you can do my DNA test again, has it changed? No. Then I become diabetic. My DNA still hasn't changed. Now I have a heart disease, I have depression, I have anxiety. My DNA still hasn't changed, and then I die. 100 years after I die, you do my DNA test again. You exhume my body, do a DNA test. We can still look at the DNA of dinosaurs, right? My DNA is still the same. DNA can't even tell you you're dead or alive, let alone are you healthier or sicker. And that was the fundamental problem. You say, wait a sec. Everyone is thinking about the problem the wrong way. That's what the experts do. What changes in your body is not your DNA. It is your gene expression. Your genes never change, but your gene expression or RNA is always changing. So think about what the gene versus gene expression is. Every part of our body is identical genes, right? My hair, my skin, my eyes, my nails, my kidney, my heart, my neurons, they all come from one single cell, same DNA. You watch all the crime shows, right? It doesn't matter they find hair, they find anything, the same DNA, right? Then why is it I don't have the eyes growing on my finger and the nails growing on my head? Same DNA. Is it because different genes are expressed and they become eyes? When the other genes are expressed, they become kidney. When the other genes are expressed, they become heart. So DNA is like an alphabet, and RNA is the story you write. So my first question was, why not just measure the RNA? Remember, we never focus on how. We say, great, we're going to measure RNA. Does that solve the problem? Well, it turns out 99% of all the genes that are in our body that are expressed don't come from our mom and dad. You know where they come from? These microbes, the microbiome that lives inside our gut, in our mouth, all over us, 100 trillion microbes that live inside us and on us that make us what we call superorganism. We live in symbiotic relationship with them. Without them, we couldn't live. Without them, we couldn't survive. Now, interesting thing was, if I started to do the Google, the Dr. Google, I started to say depression and microbiome. Wow, everything we do is connected to microbiome. Cancer and microbiome, cancer therapy and microbiome, heart disease and microbiome, addiction and microbiome. So when you start Googling, you start to see every disease is connected to microbiome. My first reaction was, wow, awesome. And then my next reaction was, wait a sec. If everyone believes that microbiome is so important, and there are tens of companies doing microbiome testing, why is this problem not getting solved? Then you go back to the first principle. What questions are they asking? Well, it turns out every single microbiome company to date asks the same wrong question. They want to know what organisms are in your gut, what organisms are in your mouth. And I don't know what these organisms mean. All I know is what if these organisms are like tiny humans. The same organism can do something good in one environment and something bad in different environment. Just like a human being, put them in a good environment, good behavior, put them in the bad environment, the bad behavior. And organisms may behave the same way. So what if we focus on what they are expressing, what they are producing, and how it is interacting with the human body, and how is that changing the human gene expression? If we can do that, now we can solve the problem. So now we knew exactly what needs to be done. Finding what microbes are expressing, finding how it is going to interact with the human gene expression, and what the human genes are being expressed, and then use AI to solve the problem, right? The next question was, now that you know, so remember, why me was, we are going to focus on completely different thing than everybody else was. Now, only thing I need to do was find a way to do this. And this is, by the way, another thing I'm going to tell you about it. If you live in United States, as a citizen, you have birthright, to be able to look at any technology that is being developed at NASA at any of the national labs, anything done by the Navy or Army or Air Force, you can go to any of their lab, you get to see everything they're working on, and you get to be able to license that from them. As a US citizen, it's your birthright. So my first thing was, wow, these NASA guys, the JPL, they're sending these landers to Mars. They obviously had to have figured out what these organisms do. So I went to JPL. And they say, we have no idea, we don't really care. We're just simply looking for any sign of life. I'm thinking, you guys are a bunch of morons. I got to go to NASA Houston. This is where all the good stuff happens, right? They're Houston. So I went to Houston, got to play with moon rocks and all the good stuff. They have no idea. Went to Kennedy Space Center. Then I went to Stanford and MIT and every university. And Lawrence Berkeley, Lawrence Livermore. I am going around trying to find someone who knows how to solve it. And then I ended up at Los Alamos National Lab. You know what the Los Alamos National Lab is famous for? Nuclear weapon, the atomic bomb. It's called Manhattan Project. It wasn't done in Manhattan, right? It was done in Los Alamos. What do you think they were working on next? The biological. Defense, not weapons. That's what I'm told. So here I am, and I'm telling them, here is the problem I need to solve. And there is a scientist who comes to me, he says, absolutely, we know exactly what these microbes are producing, and we can tell you exactly how they interact with the human body. My first question was, hey, young man, what project are you working on? And he looks at me straight in my eyes and says, what's your security clearance level? And before I could speak, he said, don't bother. Even if you told me you work for CIA, your security clearance is not big enough for me to talk to you. Okay, I said, fine. I don't need to ask you what are you working on. Now, can you tell me how you do it? Because then I can tell you I'm a US citizen, and you get to tell me how you work, what you do. And he describes to me exactly how they solve this problem. And I'm simply writing it down one by one. And then I went back to Lawrence Berkeley, and I said, I've solved the problem. How? Well, you first do this, then you do this, then you do this, then you do this. And you say, if you can do that, it will work. And I'm thinking, great. Now all I have to do is license the technology. So long story short, license that stuff, started a company called Viome. 7 years later, we have now analyzed 1 million samples, collected 100 quadrillion biological data points. We can now detect stage 1 cancer in your mouth or throat just simply with your saliva with 95% specificity, 90% sensitivity, received FDA breakthrough device designation. We are able to not only identify the disease, we can tell you what foods you should eat. When we analyze your saliva, finger prick blood, and stool, we can tell you your biological age, your cognitive health, your heart health, your gut health, your oral health. We tell you don't eat avocado because your uric acid production is too high, or don't eat spinach because your oxalates are not being metabolized, or don't eat broccoli because sulfide production is too high. And we can tell you what foods to eat and why, what foods not to eat and why. We tell you what ingredients in your supplements you need in what quantity, and we make them for you. I'm not trying to give you infomercial here, but the fact is, what I'm most proud is, we did the randomized placebo-controlled trial and showed that within 3 months, we can reduce the fasting insulin by 25% just with foods and supplements. We reduced the IBS by 48%, reduced the depression by 47%, reduced the anxiety by 42%. Now, imagine that from a guy who didn't even know what the basic human biology was for. And that was the coming back to what I was talking about. Not being an expert is your biggest asset. And I showed you the framework, I told you how I applied to it, and I tell you how you create an amazing company out of it. And it wasn't about, I am so smart. I wanted you to know that it is something you can do every day. There's nothing that I did that was saying, oh my God, he was smart. Everything I told you is exactly the thought process went through that. So now ask me after the session about what problem you want to solve, and I'll show you about exactly what questions you should be asking.
Thank you. I have 2 more that I want to hit on. One is, we've actually had a question earlier today as well about sort of, and I'll say this because I read everyone's application. We actually have a fairly high number of people that are sort of like mid-transition, right? Looking for different things. I know you and your wife have a rule about this, about when to start looking for new things, when to start making new moves. And I know this is a topic that many of our participants also think about in terms of, well, how do I know the technology is ready? How do I know I'm ready? And all of these things. So can you walk us through your framework for that?
Absolutely. So first of all, the how do I say it? The right time is always now. There is never a good time or never a bad time. And let me tell you why it is. How many of you ever had the first kid and you weren't quite ready? Right? That is really what it is. Having a baby, you never think it is a good time, and when that happens, it was the perfect time. Right? So my point I'm to tell you is that if you are ready, only time you're ready is when you do it. So here is a trick you do. When you wake up in the morning and you don't jump out of the bed, time to quit. Because when you find something that you really care a lot about, you won't be lying in bed. So here is what I tell people. You don't need to be passionate about what you're doing. Passion is for hobbies. Passion, I used to say, is for losers. People don't like my terms. Passion is for losers. The winners have obsession. Not obsession for people, not obsession for things, obsession to solve a problem. Once you find that obsession, you will never, ever go back. Once you find your obsession to solve that problem, every minute you go to sleep, you're thinking about it, and you wake up in the morning, you're thinking about it. So find something that you're willing to die for and then live for it. Or ask yourself, if you had everything in life that you wanted, the billions of dollars, the loving family, what would you do? And if you do that today, you will get everything that you want. So the thing really is to find something that you're truly obsessed about, that you're willing to give 10, 15 years of your life and willing to dedicate your life and willing to die for it. That's where it's a good time to do it.
Perfect. Thank you. And this has happened. I know your wife has at some point kicked you out of bed saying, time to quit, no?
Yeah, so basically, as you can imagine, I've done 7 companies, and every time there comes a time in my life where I normally get up, by the way, at 4 a.m. And I've been doing this for about 25 plus years. I get up at 4 a.m. And there are times when I lie down in the bed at 4 or 5. My wife actually tells me, time, just get out of bed, go do something else, you're done. Right? And that's literally what happens. I say, you're probably right. I'm just not feeling excited anymore. And I'm going to hire a CEO, and I'm going to let someone else run it. I'm going to go start something else. I'm just done. Right? And that's what happens, is because after a while, you solve these tough problems, and then it starts to become work. Now it starts to oh my God, it's more of the same. Now I have to run the company. Right? I'd rather hire someone else to run the company, and I go out and solve the next problem. And that's really what the fun is about, is that to really go find something that you're so obsessed and you're learning. And here is my rule. The day you stop learning is the day you start dying. So if you're not learning anything in your job new, you're actually dying every day. And when you find yourself in a point where you say, gee, I go to work and I'm not learning anything, you really reach the peak of that. The other thing that you talk about, that people are just afraid to start something. And this is another thing that I've found myself, is that as a person, you have to be alive. And how do you know you're alive? Is you have a heartbeat. What does a heartbeat look like? Up and down and up and down. And when it's smooth, you're dead. So when you find yourself living a smooth life, you've chosen to live a life of a dead person. When you have these ups and downs in your life, you're still alive. When you are down, all you have to do is hunker down and know the next beat is going to be up. And when you are on top of that beat, never become too arrogant, because always remember the winter is coming, and winter always comes.
Okay, I have a final question for you, because I know this is one that our participants will also ask. You've operated across many different industries, many different disciplines. And what is a method that you subscribe to sort of discern signals, right? Like, what are ways in which that you would say there's something going on here? Because there's following the curve, there's
Sure.
being ahead of the curve, but there's ways in which we can pick up signals ahead of sort of
Very
like
good.
some of the technologies.
Yeah. So this is really interesting. So what I do is I read lots and lots of science journal. So I actually use Twitter or X, and I subscribe to all the science journals. And when you start to see, instead of 10 articles, the 100 articles a month, you know in the lab there is a lot of research going on. You can be almost certain when things are going from 10 to 100 to 200 to 500 to 1,000, in the next 3 to 5 years, this is going to become mainstream. 7 years ago, I started to see a lot of research on microbiome. Everything was being connected to microbiome. And I'm telling my kids the microbiome is going to be big. And they all looked at me and it's like, this dad has gone completely crazy. What does he keeps talking about microbiome? I still remember every dinner discussion, they'll talk about something. I say, you know, that's connected to microbiome. And before I even open my mouth, yeah, that's connected to microbiome. And today, they all shut up when Lady Gaga is talking about microbiome. You know we have arrived.
Is there anything you're looking at these days?
Yeah, I think, you know, I just launched my new book called The Youth Formula. And this is about longevity. So what are the things, if you want to live healthier, longer, this is not about living forever. This is about living healthy as long as you live. Because nobody wants to live to be 200 years and spend the last 100 years in ICU, right? So how do you live to be the last day? Like, you want to die on Mount Everest. That means you are able to climb Mount Everest to be able to die there, right? So how do you do that? And I'm going to give you the summary of the book. There are 5 things you have to do. Just like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the bottommost is nutrition. We talked about that. That nutrition, one of the things we realized was there is no such thing as universal healthy food. There is no such thing as universal healthy supplements. A food that's good for you today may not be good for you 6 months from now. A food that's good for your wife doesn't mean it's good for you. So when you hear someone say, oh, you should take vitamin B, ask them, do you know what your TMA production is? Because you know the vitamin B increases the enzyme called FMO3 that converts TMA into TMAO that causes the heart disease. All that meant to say is there is no such thing as universal healthy food. So find out what foods you should be eating and get the proper nutrition. Once you get that right, the second stage is stress reduction. When you are stressed, your body goes into fight or flight response. You know why? This comes from evolution when we are being chased by the tiger. If there was no stress, you wouldn't be here today. We would all be dead. Stress is what caused our body to go into fight or flight response. And during the fight or flight response, what does body do? It shuts down what it considers to be non-essential things, like digesting your food. You're going to be lunch for someone else. Don't worry about digesting your food. The 2 things happen. You got eaten, stress went away. Or you survived, and the stress went away, and your digestive system back to work. Your immune system shuts down. And that's the reason people who are stressed get sick more often. Some of us realize that we are coming from work and we are very stressed. So we realize we're going to do something called gratitude and prayers and things like that before we eat. So we can actually move our body from sympathetic mode to parasympathetic mode, from fight or flight response into relaxed mode. Because until you do that, you cannot digest your food. So when you come and you're really angry and you're sitting in front of TV and eating the food, it's not doing any good to you. That's why people get sick. People get all kinds of issues. So now, if your work is stressing you out, quit your work. When you go home, your spouse is stressing you out, I don't have to tell you what to do there. Right? Do meditation, do things you need to do to get rid of the stress, because that's the number 2 things. Number 3 is exercise. You don't have to be a gym rat. You don't have to spend 2-3 hours in the gym. Really, the body is supposed to move. If you can get 45 minutes to 60 minutes of fast walking, and you can a little bit uphill, you're doing great. As you start to get past 40, Do some strength training. I never use weights. I do just use my body weight. I do some push-ups. I do some squats. I do some lunges. Just use body weight. It doesn't matter where you are. You can use them. And if you can do that twice a week, some type of body weight strength training, and you can get to at least 4 or 5 miles of walk, you're doing really good. So very rarely the days goes by that I don't walk at least 5 miles. Irrespective of how busy I am, I put my AirPods on and I do my phone calls. If I'm interviewing somebody, I do walk and talk. That teaches me what kind of stamina they have. I take them uphill there, and I can see how well they do. When they start to huff and puff, we know they're not doing very well for their body. But that's really is doing that. Fourth is sleep. It's not about the quantity of sleep. Everyone tells you need 8 hours of sleep. That's not correct. What you really need is about 1.5 hours to 2 hours of REM sleep and about hour and 15 minutes to hour and 45 minutes of deep sleep. And this is really what you need. If you can get them in 6 hours, you're doing great. If you need 7, take 7. If you need 8, take 8. But measure your REM sleep and deep sleep. I do that many ways. I wear Oura Ring. On my bed, I have something called 8 Sleep. 8 Sleep not only measures my heart rate variability, my deep sleep, my REM sleep, it also changes the temperature as I go into the sleep. So I like it warm when I go into the bed, and as I go into REM sleep, it cools it down. When I go into deep sleep, it cools it down further, and it keeps a separate temperature for me and my wife, so we don't argue about that anymore. She likes it cold, I like it hot. But interestingly, we can adjust the temperature. I use my Apple Watch, and I also have a Withings pad underneath me. So that's really important to know sleep. And if you don't believe me, read a book called Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. You will know the sleep is really, really important. Number 5, purpose and community. People who live a life of purpose tend to live 10 to 15 years longer than the people who have no purpose. So as I said, find something that's meaningful to you. Find something that you're willing to die for. Find something that makes you jump out of the bed every single day. And if you can find that, you will live a long, healthy life.
I like that. That's a great note to end on. Naveen, thank you so much for kicking us off for the first day of the program.
And ask me any question. By the way, if you have any question that you don't get to ask me during, you can email it to me. I am naveen.jain@gmail.com. You can follow me on LinkedIn. You can follow me on Instagram. I answer all my stuff. So just ask me any questions. And if not, I'll see you out at the fire pit.
Yes.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Naveen.
Thanks, Naveen.